Good afternoon, Rich. How you doing?
I'm well. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. So we have gathered uh, through time and space uh, to talk about various things we're both thinking about in this slightly semi-formal setting, which I am finding to be generative in other settings. But we'll see how we get on. But I thought it would be really nice to wind back to how we first met and where we were both coming from at that point. And you were one of the catalysts for that. So can you say a bit about it?
Hmm. How we first met. All I remember is that Ronan Harrington introduced us because he does that terrific stitching of social fabric where he finds, I don't know how he decides who qualifies, but he finds interesting characters and then he introduces them. And I was working with him on this thing called alter ego, which was at the time, I think our focus was like, okay, yes, we need systems change. And who's doing systems change that is thinking about the very large scale, that's not just like tinkering around the edges, but really is thinking about how to have a different way of running society. And they're also thinking about the interior dimension, like emotions and spirituality and psychology and all of those more subtle dimensions. Who's doing both? And can we bring them together into a more of a coherent movement?
Yeah. And you invited me to be part of one of these little huddles or scrums of kind of peer support. And honestly, Rich, I had such strong imposter syndrome, particularly because of that first bit. Because I was like, I don't know about systems change. I'm not thinking about how we connect different fields of social good. I'm interested in theological questions and how they relate to social questions, but mainly about feelings and creating a world where there's more space for human encounter.
Mm.
Um, and I showed up on this Zoom with five strangers and, well, four strangers and Ronan, who I knew a little bit, from all over the world. And you said, we're just going to be vulnerable with each other and support each other through the pandemic. And I thought, that sounds both fun and incredibly terrifying. Did you, by that point in your life, you kind of knew what you were doing with that really well?
I think it's so simple, it's hard to explain, but small groups, like really small, like 4 or 5, 6 people that can create a context of trust and safety and openness with each other. I think they're like one of the building blocks of a good civilization, one of a few, not many. And when I have the right small groups in my life, everything goes well. And when I don't, I'm kind of lost and confused and I lack courage and feel overwhelmed. And so it's really, that's like so much of my work now is just like trying to convince people and show them the power of small groups and give them kind of very easy recipes to, hey, look, these are some different variations of small groups that you could be in. But the whole point is about building trust, because trust is the gravy that makes society delicious.
It really is. It was weird for me because I am a church person and therefore have been in small groups my whole life. No, that's not true. Since I became Christian in my mid-teens, I've been in small groups. And it's just like part of the furniture. Often, honestly, like a slightly boring ball ache of being part of community. And it was only through connecting with you guys, you helped me see the magic of kind of consistent, committed groups of people who might not, probably don't start off friends, aren't there because they've like carefully curated the people they want to spend an hour with every fortnight, but are slightly forced together in a mishmash and then just show up and be present and listen to each other. As I came in, that like sense of coming in as someone with interest in church and theology, etc., quite quickly it became clear that that wasn't necessarily your bag at that point. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah. I've had a large chunk of my life where I've been really reactive against Christianity. And I'm not like, I've never been an atheist per se, and I've never been like actively oppositional towards religion or church or Christianity or anything. It's just that I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist Christian community, and I got excommunicated when I was 19 or 20. And excommunication was like this, I was involved very profoundly in a community of deep support and belonging, and then I was outside of it. And it's just very painful, it's really disorienting to lose all of that sense of connection. And it was like a two-way divorce as well. It wasn't just like I wanted to stay and they kicked me out. I was like, no, this doesn't work. I don't fit here. And so from the age of like 20 to, when we met a couple of years ago, 35 or something, most of that time was just pretty reactive and allergic and like, ugh, and I still have some of it. I'm not through completely to the other side, but I still have some allergies. And it's not to Christianity per se, it's more to fundamentalism. It's more to this like singular reality. And so like, for example, I'd go to a gathering and I would kind of warn people, if they were these sort of like new age hippie types, I would warn them up front and say, like, this is I'm arriving with a lot of religious trauma. So I get that you're on your spiritual quest and it's really deep and meaningful for you, but you're not going to get a good reaction from me. So just, can you be careful about how you can, but just like own your own subjectivity, like, for example, if you're really into chakras or whatever, great. Like, I'm glad that gives you meaning, but can you not force that on me? Like, can you hold that in a way where it's like, this is my lens that I'm wearing and it helps me see the world and I get some knowledge because of this idea of chakras, without demanding that I have to agree with you before we can relate. So yeah, I was basically showing up with a bunch of tension and reactivity and wariness about fundamentalism in general, and with a specific focus on Christianity.
One that's so like refreshingly self-aware and honest to be really clear on your boundaries about stuff early on. I think that's a great practice to adopt. And two, I have been thinking about, actually, I think it was partly that initial, as the group was forming, how we were working out how to be in the same space with each other and both find it nourishing. That actually meant that I felt very comfortable and very welcome quite quick, because we were forced, not conflict actually, but I was like, I don't know how to be here and not be being like boringly on brand about the Bible, because these are my lenses, right? This is my frame. This is my mother tongue. This is my source of wisdom. This is where I go. But you were honest early on. And so I was like, how do I, with the phrase we use in our community houses, how do we love each other well, which is super cheesy, but helpful shorthand. Like, how do I love Rich well? How do I not press on a raw nerve? How do I respect his boundaries? Like, what's your memory of how that worked out?
Yeah. You're one of a very short number. There's like maybe 3 or 4 people in the last couple of years that I have spent time with that obviously just love Jesus, and in a genuine love, not in a not a performance, not a desperate, not a desperate to fit in or like clinging to some naive reality just to get some kind of certainty, but just like watching you process your life and the challenge of the pandemic and making sense of the world and constantly pulling in these religious stories, and drawing so much nourishment from it, without any kind of hidden domination current, without trying to like push on anyone else, and not being either, nor were you particularly timid, I thought, like.
Yeah, I don't really do that.
And I think that's a team sport, it's not just you. I think it was like we were each trying to create something where everyone's reality is welcome.
Yeah.
And I could just see that you were getting something really potent, from being inside of this really rich lineage that has so many useful stories and reference points, and specific use of language and a calendar, and and people to turn to and stories to turn to. It's just obviously like, you're getting something good out of that, and you're not like badgering or trying to convince someone else, or like, you know, I didn't get the sense from you of a kind of moral superiority. I think that's it. And I just don't trust anyone that has a sense of moral superiority. You know, like that's just obviously that's just obviously a dysfunction that we need to come out of. And surely the best thing about one of the best things about the Christian story is the surrender to like, yeah, I'm a helpless mess, but thankfully there's like a bigger story going on, and it's called grace, and you can just surrender into it, and things go well when you do. But when it becomes like we're the good people, we're the true, we're the right, and everyone else out there has got something wrong with them, and we need to kind of like be the vector by which they get lifted up to our level, it's just like
yeah. It reflecting on it ahead of today, I think you guys gave me a real gift, because it is the first time I have been part of a group of friends where I have been able to be consistently and totally myself about that stuff, because of the nature of we were all going deep, like regularly, and have it be held, but not from a place with anyone necessarily sharing it, or, you know, just that, and the fact that that was possible, given, as you said, like really deep religious trauma, and hearing your story was very challenging, helpful, important, I think, for me to understand better more of why people are understandably so allergic to a lot of religion chat. So I just sort of wanted to say thank you for that, because it was really meaningful to me, and I think has helped me just develop a like way of being more widely, and just sort of relax into it. Oh, I can just not be defensive, but be myself, and tolerate the fact that sometimes people find that hard, and just sort of be kind and patient, and then we'll get to connecting like humans.
I'm glad. I feel like I said, it's a team sport. I think we're all doing it, and me and Ronan were responsible for like inviting you in, but it only works when everyone's contributing to that context where we are allowed to be ourselves, and to be I think there's the part of the team sport is like being attentive to what am I doing that makes the other person withdraw, you know, and like maybe I can be more considerate and temper that a little bit, and like come at it a different way. And after a few attempts, a few conversations, you start to synchronize, and we're like, right, so this is the superorganism that we form when the six of us come together. I can start to feel like what are the different limbs and organs in this emergent creature.
Yeah. I mean, your work is so interesting about that. More generally, I could geek out about that for a whole other conversation. You have been more recently talking about a reconnection with your lineage in that way. Tell me the story. What's going on? We haven't caught up in a while, so I'm just really curious.
I mean, it's good to share with you, because I don't know. You know, I'll figure it out with your questions, I think. So one of the ingredients is I got married, and that happened a while ago. But Nati, my wife, and I were, you know, we first connected 11 years ago. And we've worked together and traveled together and lived together and have very deep mutual investment in each other's well-being and shared finances, and, you know, like have that deep, solid connection and commitment for a long time. And then in 2019, we decided to get married for very boring logistical reasons. Like neither of us felt like we needed marriage, didn't feel relevant to us. It was just for immigration reasons, it'd be easier if we got married, and then I could get a passport and blah, blah, blah. You know, this like, literally we thought about it. We did it the next day at the office, like the most minimal, no ceremony, no long thinking process, no romance, no ceremony, no drama, just like going to buy stamps.
Tick box, yeah.
And And over the last couple of years, marriage has evolved to be like one of the most important things in my life. And it's like this very, we came at it with this complete lack of ceremony, but it's as if it was a magic spell that is very powerful and has changed who I am, you know?
Wow. Almost without your consent.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of consented, like I signed the thing. But it's not about me. It's about the cultural context that I live in. And so like, I've been watching, because of the pandemic, I've been watching a lot of crap TV, including various historical dramas about the Vikings and about Britain and, you know, that kind of, and European history and stuff.
I was hoping you were going to say my crap TV, which is Love is Blind.
Oh, okay. There's
Marriage
another
nonsense.
conversation about how awesome Love is Blind is, but
Awesome slash awful.
I've got great taste in crap TV. But looking at the history of Europe, I mean, the history of the world in general, it's like, it seems to be about we form into these groups and then the groups fight each other and there's like a lot of death. And then we use different technologies to like make larger groups with less fighting and less death. And some of the technologies are like, you know, economic. So we all depend on each other. So it's better off if we can trade and everyone can profit. And there's religion, obviously, like, oh, we're actually all part of the same family. Like that sense of fraternal connection extends to many more people than I can know personally. But one of the most important ingredients, I think, in the history of peace building is marriage. It's like actually cementing different families together. I think that's why Europe is as peaceful as it is because of the intermarriage between all the royal families and like what that did to our imagined community. Huh. And you know, it's rude to say, it's very, very uncool to say positive things about the royal families, but I think it has had a significant impact.
Interesting.
So like getting married inside of a cultural context with a really long history I feel like I'm part of that project of civilization building and peace building because of the stories and because of like how I had to go to the hospital for something and they would let my wife in, but they wouldn't let my girlfriend in, you know, or like when I introduce someone as my wife versus, you know, like, it's like I before I was married, I thought that I think I was in this kind of like immature state where I thought that my relationship with my partner was like completely different from my parents' relationship with each other. You know, it's like, oh, those old people with no idea what they're doing, blah, blah, blah. You know, like this very immature reaction to my parents. And then being married is like, oh, it's the same. I'm doing the same thing that they did. And I'm not special. I'm part of a long history. And so like, that's I think an example of why it's useful and meaningful and powerful to plug into lineage, to something that's just tradition and that's big and old. And like I said, it's not about me. It's not my.
You didn't have to innovate it.
Exactly. I'm just inheriting a whole bunch of stuff. And yeah, I'm choosing what I focus on and I'm bringing my particular lens to it. And other people get married and it's like not a big deal or whatever. But for me, it's like the biggest deal ever. And so that's an example of like why I'm rethinking my relationship to religion. Because I think in a way it's that marriage is just a subset of religion, you know, like there's lots and lots of these traditions that are encoded in religious tradition that I imagine could give me access to a lot of meaning and relief and not having to make it all up. And I'm trying to think like, what is it that's pushing me more and more in this direction? I think it's partly about seeing how I think people are basically like people and religions co-evolved. That's how I see it. Like, I don't really have I don't really have like a literal, at this stage, I don't have like a literal, God comes and gives people, here's how religion works, and you do that. Like, that's not really how it works in my head. It's more like we evolved from animals to become people. And there's this like process of becoming people. And like I said about peace building, like how do we actually be a species of millions or billions of people that are like not constantly killing each other? And religion's a really crucial technology for that. It's the thing that binds us. One of the things that binds us. And we have in the last century or so really like done an experiment in the West of like just getting rid of it. And it seems pretty obvious that religion's doing something important, and that I feel the lack of it. And I see people accidentally recreating it. Like I think a lot of politics at the moment, a lot of like social movements at the moment feel like really teenaged religion substitutes. And so I'm seeing this and going like, well, maybe I should just cut the crap and go to the source, like just take a second look at that and don't be defensive, but actually try on an appreciative lens and go, what's in there? Maybe there's something really useful there.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me because so many of my friends are wouldn't have self-described as Christians. Many would have self-described as atheists. And like 10 years ago, it was a definite like, yeah, you do you, Liz. Like, fine if you must. But just, clearly it's your weird kink that we will tolerate.
Yeah.
And now, and it's particularly men, it feels like there is something in the air, something on the turn, where this reassessment is happening. Maybe we've thrown this out too soon. And what I'm trying to work out is partly what's driving it, partly how much of it is just like my life stage. When most people are in their 20s, the idea of recreating what their parents had is awful, right? We want to build the world anew. We want to reject the mistakes of the past. We want to free ourselves from the shackles of tradition. And this kind of classic, like, conservatizing life stage thing. I'm just in my late 30s. Loads of my friends are at that age. We're all having a similar, maybe it might be a relief to surrender to being part of something bigger. Maybe it might be a relief to tap into these sources of wisdom rather than feeling like the weight of the world is on my shoulders alone, or me and my friends, or me and my generation. So I don't, it's terrible social science for me to take a kind of sample of me and my mates and go, there's a great spiritual reawakening happening. But I also do honestly have a hunch that it's not just that, there is also something life stagey happening more broadly, that actually you could see the 20th century as those teenage, early 20s. I mean, there's a lot of good in there, right? There's a lot of, I don't want to be disparaging about that passion and commitment of youth. I think the worst thing we can do is be like sneering and contemptuous about it. But that kind of growing more fully and growing into an adult person or an adult society requires that kind of slight ego reduction of, this isn't just about me. I need to plug into these other sources. It's possible that my kind of chronological snobbery is causing me problems and I could look back as well as forward for wisdom. Do you think it's just literally me and my mates, or do you see something else shifting?
It's definitely a thing happening with me and my mates too. But I don't know how big that field extends to. But there does seem to be, like if I think about who are the cool kids, and when I do quite a lot of traveling and I go to different cities and hang out with the hipsters, they're pretty much all on some kind of spiritual quest. Like, it's not cool to be a materialist exclusively, that's really lame. So there is this kind of
I love the idea that you just rock up at a city and are like, where's the cool kids? I'm going to go hang with them.
Yeah. It's the privilege of having a large Twitter following. So you can just find the cool kids quite easily. I mean, like the new atheists, lame. They're just like, there's no vibe there. There's no juiciness. Like, they're just really
no vibe.
I mean, seriously, what a
I
way
know
to live.
exactly what you mean, and it's just such a brilliant way of describing. Mate, no, it's not my jam. No vibes.
There is no vibes there. And at the same time, I would say that I have a little bit of disdain for a lot of this hipster spirituality. So I mentioned at the start that you're one of the few Christians that I've been spending time with that just, you kind of radiate a love for God, and you don't have I don't experience you as having a moral superiority trip. Maybe you just keep it under wraps very well. There's another one, Jeff Hilliard, and I met him at the Emerge conference in Berlin, and Emerge is like an example of these intellectual hipsters that are, and I say that with a lot of love. Like, I think they're uncovering an interesting frontier of philosophy. And Jeff and I, when we first met, we're having a conversation, and he kind of reflected on the patchwork spirituality of, these hipsters that I'm talking about. And he's like, what I remember was like, we're drawing in, like, people are doing the pick and mix thing where they're like, a bit of Buddhism, and I'll get the chakras, and I'll get this little
Astrology.
bit of, some astrology, some tarot, some Hinduism. We're going to do a cacao ceremony. People are going to take ayahuasca. It's just like all of these little sources of wisdom that people are feeling like, wow, this means something to me. This is giving me some orientation. But what he pointed out was like just the complete taboo around Christianity and around Jesus, that you just don't see Christians in those spaces, or if you are Christian, you keep it under wraps, that you don't want to come out, you don't want to be revealed there. And I'm fascinated.
Sorry, sidebar. That brings out a really mischievous part of me. It makes me want to be like super Jesus girl.
Yeah.
Just and like act the part and see how people react. And I have to really rein that in because it's unhelpful. But Karen.
Yeah. Well, because of my fundamentalist upbringing, I'm really wired to spot taboos. And like, where's the heresy, and why has this community got an immune system that prevents me from exploring these heretical ideas? And it's like going into this hipster community and realizing that the heresy is Christianity, and the inverse of what I grew up with. And like, why, and I try and ask people why, and they're like, oh, it's obvious. It's because, the Christians are so corrupt. Like, think about all the corrupt priests and the this and that and all these bad things. And it's like, yeah, but have you seen Buddhism? Have you seen Hinduism? Like, that's just what institutions of people look like. They're just full of corruption. That's just normal. Why is it that you can go and cherry pick the best of Buddhism, but Christianity is like not even something to look at? And the vast majority of my peers, they come from a Christian lineage. It's like, at least in their grandparents or great grandparents, they were like super committed, and they have this vast lineage of Christian tradition in the family. And like, it just seems, I don't know what the word is. It just seems like a blind spot to instinctively go, well, for one thing, it feels disrespectful to say like, those are kind of like primitive ideas. There's nothing in there. Like, we've got science now, we think whatever. Like, I don't even know how people think about it, but to have this divorce from lineage just seems suboptimal. And I don't know very many people that have actually investigated their divorced Christian lineage and gone, what is this? What is like, what meaning were my grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents deriving from this? And taking a serious look at that from a position of respect and curiosity. It's not, I don't know who's doing that job, but as soon as I've started doing that, like there's a whole bunch of obviously useful, like really simple stuff, like the way that the church has an annual calendar. And as you go through the year, there's like different things to think about. You're reminded of different virtues. And we've got different rituals that remind you of them. Like, that's a good thing. That's a really useful, people will buy a journal to kind of replace that.
Yeah.
There's lots of that stuff in there that, and that's a very, naive and simple example, but
No,
I think there's probably a lot of value in there. Exactly, treasure.
I wanted to ask, and I want to ask in a moment about demonology, but first I want to ask to sort of loop back to that "how can I love you well" question, both you personally as my friend, but so I'm trying to be completely honest and transparent. It is really easy as a Christian to hear people becoming less hostile and more interested in Christianity and get like super excited. And a good chunk of that is tribalism, also known as sin, which is the like, we want other people to be like us. We want other people to join our team. We want to stick a flag in them. Anytime someone in public says they like something that we like, we feel automatically warmer towards them, right? It's all there. It's all over the New Testament. Jesus is not a fan. And that is part of what goes on in me when I hear someone like you, a like unlovely football team cheer response. Like,
Yeah.
yay, join my team.
Yeah.
That will make me feel better about myself. And that, unfortunately, is like a big dollop of what drives evangelism. However, I certainly feel under that in myself a more honest and more, I hope, humane and more Christian, as far as you can ever use that word straightforwardly, response, which is just, oh, thank God. Like, there is so much joy and beauty in this, and people have been kept from it for all kinds of really shitty reasons. And some of those reasons are fading. And there might be a chance of like a bit more freedom and a bit more belonging and a bit more love in the world. And depending on which bit of that I'm reacting out of will depend on, like, I genuinely am having a lot of people want to talk about God or Jesus or church or any of the like safer sociological concepts where you can start on an intellectual basis and everyone feels safe. How can I / other Christians be actually like useful and life-giving if indeed this shift is happening and there's lots of people asking these questions? How can we be as unannoying and as untribal as possible? What actually helps?
Good question. I think for me, it's like to focus on what religion does rather than what religion says. This is I'm kind of getting this from John Vervaeke, who's one of these philosophers that I get a lot out of, which is like the difference between propositional knowing and participatory knowing. So like propositional knowing you can get from a book. You can like, these are all the propositions. Jesus died for your sins. These are the rules. This is what we believe, like all that stuff. And then participatory knowing is like knowing what it's like to be someone who's doing something. Like I can read all about aerodynamics, but I don't know how to fly a plane until I've had some practice. And so the propositions are quite challenging. Like God's 3 people. No, he's 1. Okay. And why is he a he? And like there's just like so many things where, coming from the cultural context that we're in now, it's pretty hard to just accept, a young earth creation story, for example. So it's like, just let that relax. Just relax on all the propositions, all of them. And instead focus on what church does at its best. And in my upbringing, the best thing that church did was, we had an informal system where people would get together. Our church did a morning and an afternoon service. And basically, between the morning and the afternoon service, all of the families would like semi-randomly, semi-structuredly pair off and go to each other's place for lunch. And so you have a community of 1 to 200 people organized into families, and the families are going click, 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 and having like just having contact with each other, having fellowship, you know?
Yeah.
And it's just so obvious from my work for the last decade that increasing the amount of fellowship in the world is such a leverage point. Like everyone wants it.
Yeah.
It was just like such an obvious lesson from the pandemic, right? Like we suddenly got cut off from all of our fellowship, and people had to find new ways of meeting those needs. Like focus on that. And when it comes to the propositions and the stories and the metaphors and the like, what it means to you, trying to put those into words, then I would just ask for a more pluralistic approach. That like the better you are at, like I said about the lenses, like this is a lens that I'm using to see the world, and I can tell you what I can see from this angle. And if I feel that you know that you're wearing lenses,
Yeah.
and you're kind of inviting me into a perspective that I can't access otherwise, then I can listen and I can come to my own conclusions. And like I think if you actually do trust God to do his job, you don't have to hammer it over people's head. You know, it's just like, just stop repelling. Stop being repellent.
Top tip. Don't be repellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I honestly don't know, when I make that prescription, I don't know how many people are up for it. Because pluralism is actually a really, really tall order. Like most of the people I encounter, they want, the way they make sense of the world is through a singular view, and they're not decoupled from that view. They're in it.
But I think, you know, for a lot of Christians, holding a pluralistic view themselves will be a deal breaker because of the way they read Jesus's particular complicated sayings around that. But I think even if you hold that view theologically, there is a posture that can welcome diversity and be curious about what other people think and say. I think the sort of Protestant legacy is that you need to believe before you can belong. And I think the invitation for this moment, and I've got a few friends who are coming to church without very much not being prepared to say I am a Christian or I believe in God, but are just like coming to church because belonging without believing is totally possible. And these things sometimes work in all kinds of different directions. And everyone needs somewhere to belong, right? And church, the story we get about church is that it is like deeply dysfunctional / like actively harmful institution. And my experience and most of the experience of Christians is like directly the opposite of that. Like an institution full of human beings that messes up, but that's like 3% of the whole of church, and everything else is a very human, messy, beautiful, like glorious exercise in learning to be more loving and more human and grow together and like serve the world better together. Yeah, belonging before you believe feels like
that's such an important line, because like that's basically the lesson I took away from my childhood. Was I was in a context where you could only belong if you conformed. And when I say fundamentalist, it just means that we had more detail on the beliefs than other Christians who were a bit more loosey-goosey. But I'm convinced that you can have belonging without conformity, and actually that the best kind of belonging does have a great deal of tolerance in it. And I think we're living in a context where our skills and habits of belonging have been undermined for a long time, and so we're not really good at it. And that's part of the reason we have this tribalism, which is just a shallow kind of belonging. You know, it's a kind of immature attempt to belong. Like maybe if we all think the same, then we can tolerate each other. It's like no one thinks the same. Literally no one. If you get into the detail, everyone has a different view on everything. Yeah. And it's okay, you know, like it's actually fine if we're treating each other with love and respect. Like the more love and respect and trust there is between people, the more divergence they can handle, you know. Yeah. And that should be the project, is like how do we inflate that capacity rather than how do we purify people down to the sameness that then they'll be allowed in the building.
Yeah. Because even the people that believe exactly the same thing as you can turn out to be the most annoying. It's just like that is not the ground on which like deep intimacy and human encounter necessarily happen.
And nor is it the basis of good behavior.
Yeah.
That was one of the striking things about leaving the church for me was there was a bunch of bad behavior in church and there's a bunch of bad behavior at church. And it didn't seem to be the defining characteristic of who is generous and tolerant and kind, and it didn't seem like virtue was coming from the church. There's something else going on that leads people to develop a good character.
Yeah.
So again, it's like that's why I'm like focus on what it does instead of what it says.
I want to ask you about demonology, and we're both interested in peace building and in like small groups and bigger groups that work and that have enough trust to function. And I have been writing and thinking about kind of cultural dynamics, and on the podcast that I host, The Sacred, it's a lot about what does it mean to hold the tension of being in conversation with someone not like you, who you disagree with, and notice the fight or flight dynamics in your body, and like resolve to stay in that relationship or that conversation even though it's uncomfortable. And you have this theory that I just would love you to unpack for me, because ever since I read your tweet thread about it, it's been going round and round in my mind.
I can try. Probably the best version is the tweet thread, because I think best in tweets at the moment. So anyone that goes on my Twitter and search for demon possession, they'll see it. But the gist of it is that I think demon possession is a useful metaphor, at least, for what's happening in our political conversations online. And so possession meaning this happened to me the other day in person. I was in conversation with someone about a difficult topic, and they said, "Oh, that's because you're a white man." And hearing that phrase triggered me to anger, and I was no longer in full possession of my faculties. I was possessed by rage and like defensiveness and shame and who knows what other things were going on there. But like, I lost my composure, and we were no longer in connection or communication. We're just like throwing our defenses at each other and like trying to prove that the other person was an idiot. And the conversation was broken. And thankfully we repaired it later. So that's all good. But it's a good example, I think, of like, there are these particular phrases that we can say that will trigger people. And depending on which community I'm in, I can say one phrase or say the inverse of it. So like I've been hanging out with a lot of lefties lately, and I talk about like my respect for Christianity, my respect for police, my respect for farmers, like where I come from. Marriage, all these things that are like really uncool. And it's fun to do because you trigger them and then they lose then like the I'm trolling to control them, like a puppet master. It's like, and I can say the inverse. It's like, it doesn't matter which one. It's just funny to me.
Just sidebar, this is what makes you sometimes like ultra intimidating. And I am not intimidated by you any longer because I've been in enough conversations with you not to be. But it's a bit of your personality. Carry on.
Sidebar, let's figure out what makes me intimidating, because I think I'm a little teddy bear. But yes, it's very easy to provoke people to rage. Very, very easy. And most people are too respectful to do it intentionally. They just do it unintentionally all the time. Whereas I do it intentionally because it's funny. But yeah, once you're triggered like that, you're not fully, you don't have full agency anymore. It's like, at best, you're kind of a toddler. And it's only once you've like restored your peace of mind and not just mind, but body, like you're actually peaceful again in your body, that you can make good choices and be like, oh, wow, I really overstepped the mark. I lost my composure. Like, can we repair this relationship?
Yeah. Because one of the things that state does is makes everyone look like the enemy, right?
Yeah. You get super tunnel vision, threat, freaking out. And that's, like I say, it's happening in the body more than the mind. And, when I just retold that story and said white man, you immediately knew from that phrase It's not unique to me. That's actually something, that phrase actually activates a lot of people.
Yeah.
So there are these specific phrases that are capable of invoking rage and shame and terror and dispossessing people of their agency. And so to my mind, it's useful to think about, like, in a way, you could think about those phrases as like entities with their own life, like a demon. And that, like, we're trying to talk about something important like justice and equity and safety. And if you're not careful when we're having that conversation, you can invoke the demon into the room, and at least half of the room gets possessed and is no longer there. Like, they're temporarily offline and they're just like, blah. And I didn't invent this, like, I've heard people, like these philosophers I'm mentioning, talking about this idea of egregores, an egregore being a kind of emergent collective. It's like you take all of these humans and the thing that they produce emergently, it's almost like a being. It's like a higher being. And it doesn't have full consciousness, but it does seem to have goals. It seems to be making choices. It seems to be acting. And that's certainly what social media feels like to me. But when I say egregore, it doesn't move you in the way that demon moves you. And that's because of your and my historical lineage, in the same way that having a partner is different from having a wife. It's exactly the same in all the important ways, but the wife thing plugs me into a long history where I could go back 5,000 years in history and say, this is my wife, and I'd know what I'm talking about. And the same with demon. Like, people understand, there's stories and wisdom and, specific practices about what you do about demons that might be relevant to how we address these weird dynamics that emerge on social media. And that's, I think, a good example of like why I think religion's interesting. And we can go the long way around and invent these like sanitized concepts, but I'm like, maybe we should just go straight.
Yeah. It's making me want to go and do like a close textual study of what Jesus is doing when it's framed as kind of healing from demonic possession, and bring that into, this is very nerdy, forgive me, bring that into conversation with the bits that I have spent most time with, which is what I see as Jesus explicitly peace building stuff about, like, when someone hits you on the cheek and you could see white man, like someone has literally whacked you in the face with that phrase. And the temptation in our body is towards fight or flight, is to hit back or to shut down and run away. And turn the other cheek involves this very deliberate planting of yourself to be like, yes, you have just hit me, and I will stay in whatever's happening here. I will not attack you, and I will not absent myself. And then when he talks about pray for your enemies, right? Like, don't not have any, but pray for them and seek their good. The like mischievous, disruptive, subversive energy that I see in Jesus in that, where he is encountering culture war dynamics and is like, what would it look like if we just did the other thing? Like, how do we? And that I don't yet know what it would mean to bring those different sources together, but I'm really interested in it.
I mean, the simple thing for me is just like notice when you lose your agency, and don't do that. See what it takes for you to regain your agency, and probably what it takes is small groups. Like, it takes high trust relationships where people can pull you back into your awakeness, into your adulthood, into your, like, I'm sure that's what it means to be made in the image of God, right? Is like that you can actually make choices. You're an awake being. You've got like all of these powers. Use them, and notice when you're just like running off a script and being reactive.
Yeah.
And when you're in that state, it's because like a part of you is possessed. You've actually lost something and you need to get it back.
I guess that requires like a story that there is a deeper self, and a story, like, you need to have heard, one, that that's a possibility, and two, that is a good thing to be doing, and that this reaction that we have to each other is not the righteous path, because I think where we are at the moment is that there's quite a high social status and high social capital accruing to the most outraged person. And
Totally.
therefore that feels like, well, of course I should surrender to this because this is what everyone else is doing. But the idea of interrupting that pattern and being part of communities of accountability that have a strong enough story and maybe even enough rituals around forgiveness and confession or whatever you need to hold you, because it's really hard to override that moment, right? It's like a muscle that you have to practice.
Yeah. So I, because I rejected the moral framework and the accountability framework and everything from my childhood, I had to find a new one. And I spent some time like, oh, maybe I can derive it from these like political movements. Like they seem to be on the right side. But at the root of it, like for me, there's an inner compass that, and maybe I'm naive, but I have been living as if it's true that there's an inner compass that if I'm still and have some space, like it knows what's right. And I actually think that's like an evolved sense. And like, yeah, I can participate in the tribalism and the dunking on people and the moral superiority. But if I'm quiet, like the inner compass in me knows that it's not the right thing to do, that it's not wholesome, that it's like junk calories, it's like eating junk food. It's like yum, 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 yum. But you immediately know, like, oh, that wasn't really good food for me. Like if you have the self-awareness that you can feel that. And that attunement to the inner compass, to me, that's what's got me here. And now like knocking on the door of the church again. It's a bit like, yeah, I started using this phrase recently, Christ consciousness. I don't know what that means. I just started using it for a state of mind, a posture to be in, which for me means like a way of receiving people and encountering them. And like it comes with a bunch of assumptions. Like it sort of assumes that the other person has a spark of the divine in them, no matter what state they're in and what they're saying and doing. And witnessing them and encouraging them to like blow on that little spark and elevate it and encourage it and activate it and like, yeah, give me more of that bit there. And not doing this in a very subtle way and not like, being at peace with all the other parts of them that are being dramatic or foolish or messy or whatever. And just noticing the little part in them that's like doing something very precious and right. And blowing on that and fanning that. And yeah, I think I know how to do that. And I think I know people who know how to do that. And when they're participating in a group, they can have a tremendous impact on like in a choir, you can have difference. Obviously you want difference, but it needs to be in tune. You need some kind of way of like, okay, what's our baseline? What's our reference point? And if you have people in this, what I'm calling Christ consciousness, this state of mind, this posture in a room, they can help people like find, this is how I can be with you. Yeah, it's really hard to put my finger on exactly what it is, but it's the same attitude that makes the difference between a good house party and a bad one.
You're gonna have to say more.
Yeah, I think when you bring a random bunch of people together for a dinner or something, or for a party or something, like it's not inevitable that everyone has a good time. Like there's a job there to actually welcome people. Like hospitality is a very active verb. It takes a bunch of work and attention. And welcome, again, it's not the thing that you say at the front door, it's like a way of encountering the other person and helping them settle in their body and find their place and actually experience being welcomed over the course of hours and days. Like you described in our small group, that like you actually felt welcome to be yourself. That was a job that we were all doing to welcome each other into a genuine, safe accompaniment. And And how did I learn how to do that for people? I think, yeah, by tuning into this inner compass, which is pointing at me, at something outside of me.
Mm.
It's not my brilliance, it's my attunement.
You probably actually also had some of it modeled for you in your childhood, right? Like in more or less healthy ways.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said about the families meeting each other for lunch, like some of those families are really annoying. And they still get invited out.
Because there's a baseline commitment.
That you're part of us.
Yeah. Rich, I feel like I could talk to you for a whole other hour, and maybe we can do that another time. But to honor our days, we should probably bring it to a close. Thanks for chatting. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be invited and glad to have this kind of the elasticity in our relationship where you can accept me as a excommunicated, allergic to Christianity, and a like curious about Christianity, and potentially about to lead its social movement to reclaim churches for solidarity and kindness and good meals.
And if you change your mind on all of that, and in 2 years you're doing something completely different, we'll still be friends. That's the thread, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure it's been.
It has. I will send you some stuff. I think Richard Rohr is the Christ consciousness person who speaks about this the most.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know much about him, but I know that's a phrase that he also uses that you might find useful.
I don't know where I got it from. I think Ronan might have been involved. I was saying it as a kind of like cheeky bugger, but then I realized like, no, there's a thing there. That's a real thing.
No, there really is. I think it's how Richard Rohr, is this Dominican, it's how he squares that like pluralist circle. He's like, yes, Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and Christ consciousness is the way that's embodied in the world in a million different ways. Like, there's a Gerald Manley Hopkins lines, Christ plays in 1,000 places. That you can say, you can take seriously Christ's claim about himself and have that not mean that everyone has to like pray the sinner's prayer and be attending church every week in order to be drawn into that life. I think is his. I'm probably mangling it, but anyway, I'll send you some.
The first time I started using it was at this Emerge conference.
Yeah.
And as at all conferences, there was a bunch of people there that were like really grumpy and frustrated and like, it's not doing what I wanted to do. The process isn't right. And I noticed that there was a way to receive their frustrations and grief.
Yeah.
And they'd be heard and keep them moving, get through it to the other side and be like, and look how wonderful it is that we get to hang out with amazing people, and what an opportunity. And look, there's free food. And that I had a way of going through the group and just like helping people release that thing and then be awake again and be responsive and like generative and optimistic. And that there was a bunch of us doing that, and it snowballs.
Yeah.
And then I did it at the club.
I mean, that is where I feel we still haven't managed to get together and go dancing together. But that I'm trying to write a bit at the moment about ecstasy and the transcendence and my experience with the Holy Spirit and clubbing, because they're so like, when I am full of the Spirit of God is the same feeling as when a drum and bass drop happens and the whole, like, you're part of an organism that just suddenly is moving together. It's like there's been a few experiments in like club church that have all ended in like terrible dysfunction. But if there was one that was like safe and functional, that's where I would be.
All right, psychedelic Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.